Welcome to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. This is a podcast that explores a public health approach to improving the mental health of Black boys while challenging the negative stereotypes often associated with this demographic in the society. This is a happiness research-informed podcast themed on the 8 pillars of happiness explored on my research trip to the top 5 happiest countries in the world. Now, isn't that cool? Hello and welcome to another episode of the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. It is the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast, but today I'm not sure I can guarantee a lot of smiles on the episode. As I'm sure all know by now, this is a collectively tumultuous time, especially in the Black community globally, especially in the global West, around the collective trauma we are exposed to in regards to the images and the lived experiences that has circulated our social media platforms in the last couple of weeks. So today's episode is one that comes from a place of heaviness, comes from a place of emotional turmoil, and just something that I'm not really sure how today's episode is gonna pan out in terms of the kind of energies and emotions, but I'm just going to be true to what it is that this whole process is about, and exploring, more importantly, the impact on the young Black boys that I have worked with and continually work with. So today's episode will be based on a pillar of happiness, which is freedom. I initially already recorded an episode around this particular pillar a few weeks ago, and it just seems really pertinent in this time to re-record something specifically around the idea of freedom in the context of what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Today's episode will be around the theme of freedom and how that impacts us and the society that we live in collectively, but also specifically zeroing in to the experiences and livelihoods of young Black boys, and also the lives of Black people collectively. And then we shall see how that kind of interplays in the lives of everybody else, and what roles everybody plays within that as a structure or as an individual. So again, the format would follow similarly the kind of format that we've deployed in the last 6 episodes around having research and then audio and then kind of delving further in, but it will be slightly different in that it's going to be a myriad of research in terms of some elements that I shall dip into at different points, but also I shall be reading a series of responses that's been sent to me by particularly one young person around his lived experience around the idea of freedom in the last week, and just kind of exploring that context as live as it is right now. So no people can truly be happy if they do not feel that they are choosing the course of their own life. This is a finding from the World Happiness Reports in 2012. A leading pioneer in happiness research, Vinhoven, believes that it is possible and should be the priority of the state to create a happier society. One of the ways is to ensure freedom so that people have the opportunity to choose the life that suits them best. So freedom ensures that opportunities are not limited on the grounds of a person's race, sexuality, or gender and ability. Freedom is not something that anybody can give. Freedom is something that people take, and people are as free as they want to be. So this is a James Baldwin quote, which I felt was very timely and very pertinent in the discussion of freedom. The country is only as strong as the people who make it up, and the country turns into what the people want it to become. I don't believe any longer that we can afford to say that it is entirely out of our hands. We made the world we're living in, and we have to make it over. So this again is a James Baldwin quote, which I feel is also speaking very pointedly to the time that we're in right now, and actually holding collective accountability to the fact that the world that we're in is the world that we have created and the world we've allowed to exist thus far. So actually, we're going to delve into the elements of the white awakening that has happened in the last, month or so, if that, since the Ahmaud Arbery and just the conversations that's come from that, and everybody else now, forward and reading lists and all these other anti-racist to-do lists, which, the question is, where have these things been in the last years, 30, 40 years, where have they been, post civil rights movements? These things have been happening in the line of sight of a lot of people. What were we doing then? What were they doing then? And that's the question around the fact that people need to take responsibility and accountability, that what's happening is a reflection of what they've allowed to happen too. And it's not about separating anybody or separating yourselves, especially white people particularly. It's about understanding the collective responsibility and understanding that the world that we've been living in is a contributory outcome of what you've also allowed to happen within that. And it's also important that on this journey of doing that work, if you are really committed to doing the work, if it's not tokenistic and it's not for, social media accolades, then that is the first part of accepting that role that you have participated in and you continually do because of the privileges of your existence, and how that requires a particular element of hard work, which you need to ask yourself if you're really committed to that work, as opposed to the visibility associated with the social media work, which is also important work, but it's important to understand that the on and offline work is very important, that they are compatible. Something that's really interesting and really important for me to explore when I explore this element of the quote I'm going to touch on is, a lot of people have this romanticized idea that, everybody was behind Martin Luther King when he was, protesting, especially in 1968 when the, Civil Rights Declaration was made. People thought that was peacefully done, and all these protests that was happening didn't need to happen really, and nothing was really happening in terms of violence before the declaration was made. But I'm just gonna touch on a quote that was delivered 6 days before the Civil Rights Declaration document was signed, which was before just the last speech before Martin was assassinated. So it says, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed," which is something that's super interesting when we hear in the conversation around what people think about the protests that are happening, at least collectively in the States and in a lot of states in America at the moment, but also in the UK around the idea of the kinds of violence that in small proportions are evident in certain states. And actually people denouncing that element of the protest as something that they think is not warranted or valid, or expecting that, I'm all for everything, but not the, the looting and the rioting, and being able to separate those two things. And again, that quote kind of brings it back to life for us in certain ways. And what happened thereafter is, when Martin was assassinated in 1968, 110 American cities started rioting. And after 6 days of rioting is when the Civil Rights Act was then declared and signed and passed in the state. So understanding that when you look not too far into the recent history, you see these landmarks that are heralded as, so incredibly monumental landmarks in civil rights history, and not understanding the kind of things that preceded those things. I think that's really interesting and really ignorant in a lot of people's sports, to actually separate those two things and understand that, again, freedom is something that's demanded by the oppressed. Because if the status quo is left as it is, a lot of people don't feel there's a need for other people's freedom because everything is good and cushy on their side, and that's what has been happening for so long, that events of the last few weeks really kind of brought it to the fore for a lot of people who have consciously and happily been shielded from this stuff because they chose to. But now, in the events of the last few weeks, that's not been possible for people to blissfully shield themselves from this stuff, because it's everywhere, right? It's what has been happening, and there's a lot of conversation around the shared trauma and sharing of Black trauma, and how easy that is for people to partake in that, and the kind of grief that comes with that to the community of the oppressed, who are the Black people, and having to consistently see these images and these narratives. That's, again, another part of what we're going to explore today at certain points. But just to really start by understanding the kinds of gravity of what we're talking about, firstly, just kind of highlighting some names on the state side that I'm sure everybody should know and should be aware of. And I'm sure there's long lists out there that are being passed out and being recited and reposted and retweeted. But it's important that those names are mentioned. And again, if I was going to go through all the names, I think the whole episode in itself will be filled with just the names, just on the state side, let alone in the UK and other countries. But everybody knows about George Floyd. Everybody knows about Ahmaud Arbery. Everybody knows about Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Amadou Diallo, Trayvon Martin, Ayanna Jones, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Jordan Davis, Tamir Rice, Chinedu Okobi, Sandra Bland. I mean, I could keep going, I could keep going because these names sadly don't stop. Maybe by the time I release another episode, there might be another name, but that's the reality of what we're looking at. But what's really interesting in this conversation, I think it's important that we talk about that, is a lot of people, especially in this side of the world, in the UK, most people think that this is just an American problem. This is something that we can look at on the other side of the world and say, oh my God, they are so behind. They are so evil. And people want to sleep in their comfy beds over here saying, at least we're not like that. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not the case. Because the police officers over here don't carry guns doesn't make their actions less lethal. Doesn't make the institutional insidiousness less evident to us who are the direct recipients of this. And that's something that is really important for a lot of people to really understand when we are about to address this conversation about institutional structural racism. Understanding that the fact that you cannot see it in the form of a video that is evidently showing one of the most ghastly evidences of racial manifestation doesn't mean the other forms that are less visible to you are not equally as deadly. And that's the first part of the conversation that I think a lot of people need to sit with. For years and years, there's a lot of evidence, if you choose to see it, of strategic, structural, state-sanctioned violence and discrimination and systemic deprivations and all these things that have caused mass deaths. We're going to go into some numbers, if that's relevant, because I think just being able to listen and understand and knowing by opening your eyes should be enough evidence. But for some, numbers are important. And I think we might go into that. But just for people to understand what we're really looking at, 1,741 people have died in police custody since 1990. Has there been any police officers that have been held accountable for any of these deaths? I think we know the answer to that, right? This is in the UK. 14% of deaths in police custody or otherwise following contact with the police since 1990 were from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Black men are more likely to be stopped by the police 5 times more than their white counterparts. But just some names that some people just might not be aware of because, again, it's not as publicized or it's not something that you pay attention to or put your ear down to the streets. You don't even have to put your ear down to the streets. Just putting your ear out and opening your eyes to understand that these things happening here just like they happen over in the States. But we could talk about Nuno Cardozo. We could talk about Edson da Costa. We could talk about Mark Duggan. We could talk about Sarah Reed. We could talk about Belly Mujinga. We could talk about Liam Briggs. We could talk about Smiley Culture. We could talk about Rashawn Charles. We could talk about Daniel Adewale. We could talk about Joy Gardner. These names, I could go on with them. This is just a few. Well, if you want to find out more about these things, they're not hard to find. But it's up to you to decide if you want to open your eyes to understanding that the system that you've been part of and you've created in this country also feeds and fuels these deaths. They're not knees on our necks, as evidently shown and the situation with George Floyd, but the equal death similarly. And that's important for people to really sit with and understand, because people think that this country and Britain it's not got blood on their hands. And I don't blame you on one level, because when we look at the educational system and the ways in which the legacy and empire of the British and the colonial histories are told in a curatorial way that leaves the British free of blame, leaves the British as the almighty savior and the beacon of positive example. I don't blame people for having those ideas on one level, because the educational system is rigged in that way to put that information in people's heads that Britain is not like everybody everywhere else. They didn't have a part, they didn't have plantations. They didn't have their hands in the dirt like the Americans. But do your history and do your research, you would know that, the Caribbean plantations were owned by the Brits. You know about their legacies in Africa and their hands in apartheid and all of these other ways in which the British kind of put their dirt away from eyesight. Clever, I'd say, but still something that cannot go amiss when people start to think and question the role of the British, when we think about the legacies that have brought about a lot of the things that we are seeing at the moment. Because I think that's where a lot of my frustration and pain and sorrow comes from, when having to, and not just me, I think a lot of Black people have to do this, have to convince other people of the traumas that we consistently face, what we hear about, what we know exists through our lived experiences. Without having these numbers, a lot of people don't believe that stuff, because they're like, no, you're just making stuff up. That's not how we're over here. That's the States. It's so bad for them over there. But that's the biggest denial there ever could be. And it still happens today. Still happens. Even in the last week, I saw that on major news channels of, incredibly articulate Black scholars on there trying to debate with people about the history of British involvement, which has led to a clarity in the disproportionate impact of deaths and police incarceration, mental health act attainment, all of these things. So it's still very prevalent, it's still very present. You just need to want to listen and want to see and want to hear and live with the guilt that might come with that. But I don't need that guilt. Nobody needs that guilt. We just need action. We need change, right? That's what's necessary right now. So I'm just going to play you a clip from a young person. And this clip is very different to every other clip I've played you, because I recorded this vocals based on a text a young person sent me just yesterday, which is what inspired this particular episode, because I've been in my own personal process of just dealing with the feelings of this in the last couple of weeks, and reaching out to these young people and trying to connect with them and seeing how they're feeling and seeing what they're dealing with at the moment. And I got this message, and it had a reverberation through my whole body, and I thought I needed to do an episode. Words from a young Black boy in response to the Black Lives Matter. Hi, sorry for the late reply. For some reason you were in my requested section. Anyways, I would honestly love to send you a voice note, but because my phone broke, I'm using my old mashup phone, so the microphone doesn't work. Anyways, about the BLM. I actually find it proper heartbreaking to see so many people getting wrongly victimized for the skin color. And in the moment, it's even worse than it looks on camera through my own experiences. To be honest, I don't really like telling people what had happened to me, but I was out and about a day or two ago when it was cold, so I was wearing one of my tracksuits. What happened was that on my way back home, I was in a slight jug car. I was late home, so I wanted to get home before my dad. So unaware, 2 police officers were following me and started running. Still unaware, I was going home until they called out at me, shouting, "Stop running!" So I stopped and waited for them to catch up. However, when they arrived, they still cuffed me and put me to the ground. Not telling me what I did, so I persistently questioned them while they put me in a car and searched me, while they said, "1 second, sir, stop asking." At the end of the whole dilemma, they took me to the police station and made my dad pick me up, with their only reason being they thought I was a person that attacked an officer in the BLM protests. So yeah, it obviously hits you hard when it's happened to you personally and you don't really see how bad it is until it's happened to you, if you get what I mean. Sorry the messages are so long, it's just because you've always helped me with stuff like that since we've met, so I thought that out of all people you deserve to know the most. Thanks, sir. So listening to the recording of this young person's audio and his vocals and his feelings, for some reason, on one level, that really affected me much more than just how I've been feeling personally in the last week. Just hearing this 14-year-old young person, he's 14. Just hearing that in the last couple of days, this young person is still having to live this existence based on this physicality, this physical tracksuit that he can't take off, which is his skin. Realizing that when this was happening, he was not in a vacuum. This was in a public space. Where were the other people around? Why weren't people stepping up and saying, why are you harassing this young boy? Clearly, he's a young boy. What is it that this young boy has done? Why are you putting him in cuffs? He was asking the police officer, why are you arresting him? They didn't tell him nothing, which again is against the law. For them to not tell him nothing until a later date when his father was there to say to him that he looked like somebody who assaulted a police officer in the Black Lives Matter protest. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? In a crowded space of thousands of people, you stop in one young kid in an area that's not where the protest happened. He was wearing a tracksuit, and you arrest this young person, put him in cuffs because he looks like somebody. So, just understanding the double trauma that this young person is living. He's already aware on one level about what's happening globally and what's happening in the country that he's living in, and him just trying to do the regular things that he does, trying to make it home before his dad gets home because he needed to just take a step out and go to the shops. And then his father having to pick him up at the police. That could easily have been at the coroner, having to identify the body or something. Because there are cases that have gone like that, and that's been the outcome. So for me, there was a deep layer of sadness around that, but deep layer of fear that, this is the normality for these young people. This is a normality for me. I mean, I have countless cases. One in particular of interactions with the police officers that have resulted in things like that. But this isn't about an individual experience, and that's what the whole conversation is on today's podcast. It's not about that. It's about understanding that collectively this is a systemic thing. If it doesn't happen to me, it happens to the next dude. If it doesn't happen to the next dude, it happens to all of us. And until people open their eyes to understand that this is the lived experiences that we've been in for the longest, that's when people can understand what roles they can play, not be bystanders, not just be passively not racist, not requires action, And that's something that I think is important to really explore, because we think about all the things that have been happening in the last couple of weeks, especially, I'm going to, case in point, the Blackout Tuesday. All I saw for the longest was just people posting black squares and just Black Lives Matter hashtags and just understanding, what is this? What's the story? I had to do my research and understand that, this was originally created by two black women, as most movements for liberation of black people are from black women. Two black women, Jamila Thomas, Brianna Agyemang. They're executives in the music industry. They created this to be able to create space in the music industry and music execs and corporates to have conversations specifically around what accountability they need to take on to be able to make change that they have also been complicit and actively participant in, to be able to bring change to black lives. But as always, this was co-opted either ignorantly or even consciously and in a very insidiously negative way, to kind of bury a lot of stories, lived experiences, truths about the Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of people were very, present in this conversation. Almost every other person was, posting these black squares and putting Black Lives Matter hashtags. And it's important. This is a learning. This is a lesson for most people, because in this work that needs to happen, we can't be just followers. You need to do the work and do the research, understand where things are coming from, understand the repercussions, right? Before you jump on a wagon that might end up being detrimental to the lives of somebody or some people or a group of us all. That's important, to ask the question, to do the dirt, to understand where is this coming from? What's the source of this? Because a movement that was super important and imperative to be able to start the discourse around repatriation and challenging institutions to put back into cultures and people that they've stolen from, easily became something that was just a trend, and people were just posting just for visibility of activism. And that's, again, something that's really important to really think about, especially when we think about just the influx of information and reading lists and all these things that are on social media platforms, especially from white people who are meaning well, I'm sure, and they're really trying to show that they're doing that work. But the most important thing is the question, what type of work is happening? Is it online work only, or is it also offline work? Which is the most important work, I'll tell you. Because I couldn't really give an F about a hashtag. I mean, it's really important, and I think it does do some collective damage on the online sphere. But what's really important, what's affecting me on a daily, is what you're doing on an offline. How you are interacting when a young boy is being accosted by the police officer for doing nothing and be put on the ground and have handcuffs on him, and you're just walking down the street. That's the work that I need. You need to retweet what you're doing there. Retweet that for everybody else to see. Retweet that to the police officer in real time. Let them know that I'm not standing for this. If you don't arrest me with this young kid, you ain't taking him nowhere. That's the kind of activism I'm expecting. Don't just post a black square and tell me you about this movement. Because that's really what the real work is. It's okay to post, direct people to Layla Saad and to Rachel Cargill and to Rani Eddo-Lodge, who are amazing writers and amazing women who are doing some amazing work. But don't just do that. That can't be your only task. And you can read their books. That's amazing. But you should have been reading their books from forever. You should have been doing that work from forever. You don't need to see knee in somebody's neck to know that that's work that you needed to be doing. But what's also important is you need to activate yourself. I'm not telling everybody to be activists because we don't need that many activists. You need to be an ally. You need to listen. You need to create space. Don't reach out to your black friend and say, I'm thinking about you, I love you, or whatever. That's empty words to me. You need to be putting that work in your place of work. If you see what's happening to the black woman that's there and how she's being spoken of or how she's being spoken to, understand that you're getting paid more than them and you're doing the same work. You need to be active and challenging those institutions like you should have been. And that's what real work looks like. And that's what I'm really interested in knowing with the people that are posting and the people that are retweeting, which is great. There's a lot of resources out there, but there's resource fatigue. A lot of people just keep seeing that stuff and think, oh, I'm gonna read it. But that stuff don't actually activate if you're not doing. So that's important. You need to be asking, are you doing that stuff? Are you putting that work in? It's not something that's going to be trendified and, after a few weeks, you can just put that back on the shelf. When the pubs open again and the clubs open again, then you think, oh, yeah, that was exhausting, man. Now I need to get back to just doing what I do usually. We can't do that. Because, again, we the oppressed are going to have to deal with what's always been happening. We're going to have to keep fighting for that freedom and keep rioting and looting like people are unhappy to see. And that's the question that I really want to ask people. Are you really about doing that work? It's a long-standing thing. But that comes from you being committed to doing this work, not because you have a black boyfriend, not because you're married to a black person, not because you have affinity to blackness or black culture. This just needs to be everybody's job. You don't have to have a core direct connection to understand that that's a job that you should be doing regardless. And that's something that's really important. And let Blackout Tuesday be an example for the kind of work that needs to happen, not the sheep mentality that's always been happening. People need to think independently for themselves and put that work in and do what's actually necessary. And that's what true allyship is, showing up not just in marches, because that's great, you should do that, but also in the micro. How do you show up? Because you're not going to get fired if you approach this conversation with the boss and let them know that that's not acceptable. We ain't doing that. In the school, squaring up to the head teacher, letting them know you're not going to exclude this young person for just saying that or for doing that. Because this young person is much bigger than this one incident. Challenging them to create other interventions within the school to readdress the disproportionate impacts of a lot of the systems within the school on this demographic. That's what's important, not the retweets or the shares. Again, don't get me wrong, those things are also important, but one cannot exist without the other. And if you had to choose one, I'd rather you do the offline stuff. The stuff where you don't get the gratification, where you don't get the notoriety, because that's important. That's more important to me. That's more important to the young black boys. That's more important to the young women, black women, people of color. That's important. Again, understanding how insidious this country is. There's a COVID report that was supposed to come out like a week and a half ago. It's come out now. And that report was commissioned to really dig into some of the factors that have disproportionately impacted, that caused the disproportionate impacting of black lives that have died overwhelmingly as a result of the COVID. It emerged that there was a lot of delays in this report because they were scared at the close proximity this report's release has had to the global unrest, especially within the UK as well. So they feel like, if they release this report, it's going to really rile people up more. But what's been revealed is that even in the report that was released last couple of days ago, there was very important sections that were taken off because they know that if those sections were being published, people were going to even be more angry. This again shows how deeply things are within this country, again, which we have to prove that to people for people to know that this is the truth and the realities. So again, another thing that's really been important and it's really riled me and a lot of really important workers on the ground up is this idea, of the blackout, when a lot of brands co-opt this, a lot of institutions, especially like the police, they made a statement, something about, we stand with people who feel like the ways in which George Floyd was murdered wasn't acceptable. We stand with them. And what's really, really, really disrespectful about that is the fact that there has never been an accountability on their part about their roles of the consistent murders and detainment and deaths in custody, injuries, and turning people into vegetative shadows of themselves. Not been any accountability or apology. It's just twisted statements and lies. And yet they had the audacity to get on a high horse and talk about how they stand in solidarity with people who think George Floyd's murder was despicable. That's ridiculous. And that's something that's really, again, shows the lack of accountability in this country. And that epitomizes it. And that's why that should never be accepted. And that's why they should be put to the account to really defund these police institutions, to put this money in other places that have proven to be much more effective in creating a much more equitable, equal society. Thinking about the fact that the UK is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, supplier of riot gear and riot apparel to the American police force and the army. But yet, to get PPE for workers who are on the front line, it's taken forever, if at all that has even happened. I mean, that in itself is something that's really perplexing, right? And it must be something that must be alarming for a lot of people to understand and to witness, to see that. And that's really important. That's where all the money goes to. But yet you can't put PPE in the hands and the faces of people who are out here saving lives. Because majority of them are going to be black and they're going to die from that anyway, right? And that's important to really start to understand this. There's a lot of brands that are jumping on this and saying, yeah, we putting out all these half-ass statements talking about how they in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. You need to put your money where your mouth is. You need to look through your institution and think about how many of these boards and these senior leadership teams reflect this demographic of people. How many of these decision-making people in your institution reflect us? Don't just talk about how you're in solidarity and put some money in people's pockets, which, don't get me wrong, that money is important and that money is necessary. But that can't be the only thing that you're talking about. You can't just get a blight for putting out a statement that a good PR team put together if you're not actually restructuring and revisiting your company protocol and your wage scheme that's disproportionately affecting people of color. That's the real work. So CEOs and CMOs and all these people, don't be out here putting out statements if you've not really put out action plans and talked about what you're really going to change, because nobody cares about that. Be really about that work. And that's what the real thing is about. It's about accountability and putting people to the real test. Don't reach out to me and say you want me to come and talk about something if you, as an institution, are not really trying to put that work in and restructure things and put things in place for a better experience for the people that are marginalized in those institutions, in the companies, in the corporates. That's the real work. So for me, as a take home, what's really important is, firstly, giving Black people the space to feel, to emote however we feel like it's right. There's no one right way. And I hear and I see a lot of people talking about, oh, this person has been, rapping about this or making music about this or making art about this for so long. Now it's time for them to show their activism. I'm like, you don't have no right to say how somebody should show an activism. He's Black. They're Black. The fact that they are in that skin, they're dealing with so much. You have no right to say when they should come out and talk about this or do this or be out here on the front line. You don't know what they're doing. And even if they're not doing anything, they have the right to also be not doing that. And that's important. Give people space to grieve and to process and to emote how they feel is necessary for them. And allies, just provide space. If we want something, we'll come to you. But what you should be doing is speaking in your family, speaking to your friends, holding groups where you're actively working through these things and challenging each other and challenging parents and grandparents, because that's the important work. They're the ones that need all the energy that's going to make a lasting impact in the lives of me and the young people that I work with, because those are the people that sit on the boards. Those are the people that make decisions. Those are the people that choose what kid gets kicked out of school and what kid gets parole or what kid gets a reduced sentence. Those are the people. You need to be putting that energy towards those people and changing their mindset, educating them with all the reading lists, divulging that information for them to be able to understand that and change over their mindset and their character. That's important work. And from Black people to Black people, and this is the bit that's really important, and this is the bit that I don't have the answers, but I know the thoughts around it. We need to strategize in a different way. Because thinking about this made me realize there's no Black schools where we can go in and put together curriculums ourselves and model new histories to young people and provide support systems for each other. When we think about collective economic independence, those things I have no idea about, but we need to be talking about that stuff because it's important that we need to restructure these systems and put them to account and make these things reflective of us. But what's also important is that we need to create systems, and that's the hard work. I don't have the answer, but I'm listening. I've been on Zoom calls discussing with a lot of great minds about what we can do and how we can make things happen and how we can do things like that. And I'm here, I'm all ears, and I just know we need to be doing that stuff. We need to be working collectively. We need to be pooling our skill sets to make things happen on a ground level. We need to be doing that on a macro level. And it's the conversation about back home in Africa and the Caribbean and how we can also collectively make work happen across continent. And these are massive, massive conversations. These are massive talks. And I don't claim to even be remotely clear in my thinking around that. I just know that there's a lot of those feelings and those communication streams that I've been privy to in the last couple of weeks, and I'm very open to having those conversations and discussion points. But we need to do that. And then lastly, I think a lot of people talk about just what's been happening over the last couple of years. That yes, it's been black on black murders. So how dare people be, aggrieved now because this is happening once in a while. White police officers are killing black folks. That really riles me up the most, because those are people that don't understand systems. They don't understand the structures that create the conducive environments for things like that to be the norm. They don't understand the impacts of generational trauma. They don't understand the impacts of systemic infiltration to communities that are just trying to survive. Because on the one hand, we need to have that conversation internally about how we value each other and how we value each other's lives, and how to process the trauma that inevitably leads to violence, how to be best equipped with the tools to be able to seek support, to be able to provide access routes for people in impoverished areas to opportunities, to educational platforms that ultimately bring about positive trajectory in people's lives. Like, we need to understand the collective systems that are in place that make those things much more easier to happen. But those critiques need to happen within our own community. We need to have those conversations about how we value each other, how we love each other, especially black men, how we show that and how we empower each other. But that is not an excuse for anybody saying, well, you need to fix that first before we can think about giving you your life, before we can think about protesting for you, before we can think about how devalued you are in the world that you live in, that you built. And that's really important. Again, today's episode had no structure to me. It was just me getting stuff off my chest, and it's probably, well, I hope there was something that you could take away from today. And thank you.